For years, Mom told everyone I was a liar. At my wedding, she slammed a forged bank statement across the giant screen for 155 guests and seized the microphone with a venomous smile. "Don't clap for her," she snarled. "You're applauding a disgusting fraud who's been robbing her own family blind." The ballroom detonated, gasps exploding into boos. Every face I'd trusted my whole life twisted in disgust, staring at me like I was something filthy they wanted to scrape off their shoes. I'm Molly Bolton, forensic accountant. 12 brutal years of her lies had sharpened me into a blade. I didn't cry. I didn't fight. I simply turned to Grant, smiled, and whispered, "Begin." He walked up and hit play. My mother, who had never once lost her footing in public, staggered violently in her heels, clutching the table as if the floor had vanished beneath her. She had no idea I'd already counted everything. And she had no idea the $1.8 million she'd stolen had a paper trail with her own voice on it. To understand how my mother ended up clutching a banquet table in front of 155 people, you have to understand what she'd spent 12 years building. Not the company, the story. The story was the real estate she actually lived in. The story was simple, and she told it well. Molly exaggerates. Molly rewrites things. Molly remembers events that never happened. I heard it so many times growing up that I stopped knowing where her version ended and mine began. At family dinners, she'd lean toward an aunt, lower her voice just enough that I could still hear it, and say, "Oh, that's just Molly. She rewrites everything." Then she'd smile at me across the table like we were sharing a joke. The aunt would smile too, and I would sit there with a fork in my hand, learning, one dinner at a time, that what I felt and what I'd seen counted for nothing. She never hit me. She never screamed at me at home. Her method was quieter and more durable. She took the things I knew to be true and handed them back to me bent. After a while, you stop trusting the part of yourself that knows things. And her face always said the same thing. "You got it wrong again." There was a night when I was 16 that I think about more than I'd like to. I came downstairs for a glass of water and stopped in the hall because she was on the phone in the kitchen and I heard my name. "I worry about her," she was saying, in the warm, confiding voice she saved for people she wanted on her side. "She's not stable, between us. She makes things up. The therapist says it's attention." There was no therapist. I had never seen a therapist, but by the next holiday, 3 relatives were treating me like a girl who needed careful handling, and I learned that you don't have to lie to a person to ruin them. You only have to lie about them to everyone else before they get the chance to speak. There was a Thanksgiving, the year I was 14, that I can still play back frame by frame. A check went missing from my grandmother's purse. A small thing, $40. My mother found it in my coat pocket, in front of everyone, and held it up the way you'd hold up evidence. I had never touched it. I said so. I said it plainly, the way my father had taught me to say true things. My mother looked at the table full of relatives, then back at me, and her face did the thing it always did. The slow, sad, patient disappointment of a woman carrying a difficult child. "It's all right, sweetheart," she said. "We know you can't always help it." I have thought about that sentence for 17 years. "We know you can't always help it." She didn't accuse me. Accusations can be answered. She forgave me, out loud, for a thing I hadn't done, and forgiveness can't be answered at all. You can't argue your way out of someone's mercy. I sat there at 14 with $40 I never took, and a table full of relatives looking at me with kind, careful eyes, and I understood, without the words for it yet, that I had just lost an argument I was never allowed to have. I found out years later, from a cousin who'd never liked her, that my mother had put the check there herself. By then, it didn't matter. The story was already concrete. I believed her. For a long time, I believed all of it. If you've ever been the one your family quietly decided not to believe, You already know the exact weight of that. Stay with me, because this is the part where it turns. It turned the day my father gave me something she couldn't reach. My father, Walter Bolton, died in the spring of 2013. I was 19. He had been sick for 8 months, and by the end he was a smaller man than the one I'd grown up with, but his eyes stayed sharp until almost the last week. The day before he stopped being able to talk, he asked the nurse to step out, and he asked my mother to step out too, and for once she did. He held out his hand. In it was a fountain pen. Black, heavy, the cap worn smooth where his thumb had ridden it for 30 years. I'd seen it 1,000 times. I'd never been allowed to touch it. "Take it," he said. I took it. "When you're ready to read the number," he said, "ask Russell, not before." I didn't understand. I thought it was the medication. I thought he was saying goodbye in a code I'd never crack, the way dying people do in movies. I said, "Okay, Dad." And I closed his fingers around mine around the pen, and I told him I loved him. And that was the last full sentence we ever had. I put the pen in a drawer. I kept it for 12 years, and I never once understood why he'd handed it to me like it was the most important thing he owned. The funeral was small. My mother wore black beautifully. People told her she was strong. People are always telling women like my mother that they're strong, because women like my mother make sure of it. I stood at the back in a borrowed coat with a pen in my pocket, and I watched her accept condolences, like a tax she'd already budgeted for. 3 weeks after we buried him, she gathered Bryce and me at the kitchen table and told us the truth, or what she called the truth. "Your father left us nothing but debt," she said. "I'm going to be honest with you both, because you're adults now. There's no money. There was never any money. He hid it well, but it's gone. I built everything you ever had, and now I'm going to have to build it again from ashes." Bryce nodded like he'd expected it. I just sat there, nothing but debt, from ashes. It didn't sound like my father, who balanced our checkbook at the same desk every Sunday, who taught me long division on a paper napkin, who once drove 40 minutes to return $11 a store had overcharged him on principle. But I was 19 and grieving, and she said it with such certainty that I folded it into the file with everything else I'd gotten wrong. 2 years later, my mother was wearing a diamond bracelet that caught the light when she gestured, which she did often. Ashes don't buy diamonds. But I didn't say that. I'd learned not to say things. What came next, she framed as discipline. My college fund, the one my father had mentioned more than once, was gone with the rest, she said. So I'd have to figure it out. Loans, 2 jobs, a degree I paid for 1 semester at a time, sometimes registering late because a paycheck hadn't cleared. Meanwhile, Bryce, 2 years older, somehow had his tuition handled, his first apartment handled, the down payment on his condo handled. The asymmetry wasn't subtle, and she never bothered to hide it. She framed it instead, the way she framed everything, so that the difference became a verdict on me. "Bryce is steady," she told a cousin once, in front of me. "He doesn't create drama. Molly, well, you give Molly money, and she'll have a story about why it wasn't enough." When I asked about the difference, once, carefully, she looked at me with something close to pity. "Bryce earned it," she said. You'll twist this story, like you twist everything. You always make yourself the victim." So I stopped asking. I put my head down. I picked the most unforgiving major I could find, the one where a number is either right or it isn't, and no amount of charm can change it. I became a forensic accountant. I spent my 20s learning to read the difference between what people say happened to money and what actually happened to it. I learned that the ledger does not care who is charming. I didn't know yet that I was training, very specifically, for one job I would not be assigned for over a decade. 12 years after the funeral, 6 weeks before my wedding, a man I had nearly forgotten called my phone. His name was Russell Ainsworth. He'd been my father's business partner before I was born, back when the two of them ran a small insurance brokerage out of a strip mall. I remembered him as a tall man who smelled like cedar and slipped me peppermints at Christmas. I hadn't heard his voice in over a decade. "Molly," he said, "I've been waiting for you to be ready." "Ready for what?" "Walter said you'd come when you were ready." A pause. "You're getting married, I heard, so I think you're ready, whether you came asking or not." I almost hung up. I thought it was a scam, the kind that targets people around big life events, but he said my father's name the way only someone who'd loved him says it. Walter, not your dad, not Mr. Bolton. And he said one more thing before I could talk myself out of it. "I have something he left for you. It isn't an explanation. He was very clear it shouldn't come with one. He wanted you to read it yourself." We met at a diner halfway between us. He was older now, smaller, still smelled faintly of cedar. He didn't make small talk, which I appreciated, because small talk is where my mother lived, and I'd had enough of it for one lifetime. He set a manila envelope on the table between the coffee cups and put his hand flat on top of it for a second, like he was making sure of something, and then he slid it across. "He gave me this in 2013, Russell said. "Before he got too sick to think straight. Told me to hold it until you came asking. You never came asking." He looked at his coffee. "I told myself you didn't need it. When I heard about the wedding, I realized I'd been lying to myself for 12 years, same as everybody else." I opened it. Inside was a letter in my father's handwriting. I'd know it anywhere, the way his sevens had little bars through them, and a stack of documents underneath. I read the letter first. "Molly, if Russell gave you this, it means you finally asked, or I finally ran out of patience from wherever I am. This money is yours alone. Your mother holds it in trust for you until you're 25. After that, it's yours to do anything you want with. She will tell you it doesn't exist. She will tell you a lot of things. Count, don't argue. You were always the one who counted. Love, Dad." I read it twice. Then I looked at the documents. A life insurance policy. Payout, $1.8 million. Beneficiary, a trust. The trust named one beneficiary, in full. No abbreviation. Molly Ann Bolton. The trustee, until the beneficiary reached the age of 25, was listed as Diane Bolton. I was 31 years old. I had turned 25 6 years ago. I set the papers down on the laminate table very carefully, the way you set down something that might be live. "You knew," I said. "I knew there was a trust," Russell said. "I didn't know what your mother did with it. That wasn't my business, and she made very sure it stayed that way. But I knew Walter wanted you to have proof it existed. That's the one thing he asked me to keep. The proof. There was no money. There was never any money. He hid it well, but it's gone. I'd built 19 years of myself, and then 12 more, on top of that single sentence. And the sentence was a lie, sitting in a manila envelope in a diner with my full legal name typed across it. "I have to ask you something," I said, and I was proud that my voice didn't move. "When she told us he left nothing, did you ever hear her say it?" "At the funeral reception," Russell said, "to a room full of people. She said, poor Walter, he meant well, but he left us with debts I'll be paying off for years." He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the saucer. I almost said something then. I didn't. She was the widow, and I was just the old partner. I've regretted it for 12 years, and I decided I wasn't going to regret it for a 13th. I drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat. I didn't cry. Something else came instead, something cold and very clear, like a window opening in a stuffy room you'd stopped noticing you couldn't breathe in. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the liar in the room. She was. That night, I took the fountain pen out of the drawer where it had lived for 12 years. I understood it now. Not all of it, but the shape of it. When you're ready to read the number, ask Russell. My father had been telling me, with his last sentences, that there was a number, and that someone would hide it from me, and that when I was strong enough to look at it without flinching, the proof would be waiting with the one man he trusted to wait. Grant found me at the kitchen table at 1 a.m, the papers spread out under the light, the pen in my hand. "What is it?" he asked. My mother told me my father left us nothing. I slid the insurance policy toward him. He left me $1.8 million. She's been holding it the whole time. Grant read it slowly. He's a patient man. It's the first thing I loved about him. When he finished, he looked up and asked the right question, which was not, "Are you okay?" but, "What do you want to do?" I looked at the pen in my hand. "I'm not going to fight her," I said. "I'm going to audit her." Because here was the thing my mother had never understood about the daughter she called a liar. If a trust held $1.8 million and the money was gone, it didn't just disappear. Money never disappears. It moves. It moves through accounts and statements and signatures, and it leaves a trail. And reading trails is the one thing in the world I am very, very good at. I started where I always start, with the money and the lie it had to tell to move. The insurance company confirmed the payout in writing within a week, $1.8 million, dispersed in 2013 to an account controlled by the named trustee. That was the last clean fact. After that, the money went dark, and dark money is exactly what I'm trained to find. As the named beneficiary who had long since passed the age of distribution, I had a legal right to the trust's records. I requested a full accounting. The first response was silence. The second was a partial production so disorganized that, to anyone less stubborn, it would have looked like a dead end. It wasn't a dead end. It was a man-made swamp, and I have spent my career draining man-made swamps. The records came in a banker's box. I spread them across my dining table, and I read every page the way my father read a checkbook on Sunday mornings. The pattern emerged in the second night. The $1.8 million didn't vanish. It walked. Over 14 months, it moved out of the trust in increments, never round numbers, never the same amount twice. The careful, irregular footprints of someone who knows that round numbers get noticed. And each increment landed in the same place, the seed account of a new company called Crestline Capital Group. Crestline Capital Group. My mother's firm. The empire she'd built from ashes. The thing she invoked in the toast at every family event for a decade. I started with nothing, and I built this with my own 2 hands. She'd started with $1.8 million. My $1.8 million. $8 million. But money moving out of a trust requires authorization. A trustee cannot simply transfer a beneficiary's funds into her own company. She needs consents, signatures, and the records had them. Page after page of consent forms, each one stating that the beneficiary, me, had been informed and had agreed in writing. Each one signed. Molly Ann Bolton. I had never seen these documents in my life. I had never been informed of anything. I pulled my own files and started matching dates against the consents. The earliest consent was dated September 2013. According to that page, on the day I had supposedly sat down with my mother and authorized the transfer of my own inheritance, I was 400 miles away at freshman move-in. I had a dorm check-in record time-stamped that morning. I had a dining hall card swipe from that same evening. I had, in other words, a documented physical impossibility. I hadn't signed anything. Someone had signed for me. I laid the forged signatures next to 50 samples of my real one. My lease, my loan applications, 12 years of exemplars. The forgery was competent. It got the capital M right, the loop of the B. But signatures aren't drawings, they're motor habits, and you cannot fake the speed and pressure of a hand that has signed its own name 10,000 times. The forger had drawn my name slowly, the way you copy a word in a language you don't speak. I sign mine the way I breathe. I went further than I needed to, because going further is the difference between being sure and being able to prove it. I cross-referenced the consent dates against the trust's actual disbursement dates and found that 2 consents were dated after the money had already moved, paperwork created to cover transfers that had happened weeks earlier. That's not sloppiness. That's a person manufacturing a record after the fact, because she never imagined anyone would lay the pages side by side. She had built her entire defense on my reputation as a liar, a daughter no one would listen to. She'd built it so well, it never occurred to her the daughter might learn to speak a language that didn't need to be believed. I hired a professional examiner anyway, because I do not trust conclusions I want to be true. That's the discipline, that's the whole job. The report came back in clinical language that I read like poetry. Signature inconsistent with Molly Bolton's verified exemplars. Letter forms suggest deliberate imitation by a second party. There was one more thing, a small thing. I almost missed it, because it was the kind of detail that hides in plain sight precisely because you've seen it your whole life. My mother had a bracelet. Diamonds. White gold. The kind of piece that announces a price before it announces a taste. She'd worn it to every holiday I could remember, and she had a habit of touching it when she talked, turning it on her wrist so it caught the light. Whenever anyone admired it, she gave the same answer, soft and a little sad. The last thing your father ever gave me, right before he passed. I'd believed it like I believed everything else, because grief makes a person generous with other people's stories. In the Crestline records, buried in the early expenditures from that seed money, was a line item, a jeweler, $62,000. The date was 8 months after my father died. The last thing my father ever gave her, purchased 8 months after we buried him, with money that belonged to me. The thing she showed off most was the heaviest piece of evidence she owned, and she'd been waving it at me across holiday tables for a decade. If you've ever watched a family decide you are the problem, comment one word for me. Scapegoat. I want to know how many of you are out there, because the next part is the part I never thought I'd get. I sat back in my chair. Somewhere in the last hour, without noticing the exact moment it happened, I had stopped feeling like a victim. Victims wait to be believed. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. I was holding a complete forensic reconstruction of a 12-year crime, and the criminal didn't know I could count. She didn't build an empire. She spent mine. I let myself feel the full weight of it for exactly one night, because there was a cost I had been avoiding looking at directly. Those forged consents required a witness signature to be processed and accepted, and they had one on every single page. The witness was my brother. If I pulled this thread, Bryce came apart with it. The boy whose tuition was handled, whose condo was handled, who had nodded at the kitchen table like he'd expected it. Grant found me on the back step near dawn. I told him the part about Bryce. He was 21, I said. Maybe he didn't understand what he was signing. Maybe she told him it was a formality. Maybe, Grant said. He sat down next to me on the cold step and didn't reach for me, because he knows I don't want to be reached for when I'm thinking. And maybe you've spent your whole life carrying people who never once carried you. He had 12 years to find you and tell you the truth. He spent them keeping her secret. You're allowed to stop protecting people who never protected you. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about a kitchen table and the word ashes and a 19-year-old in a borrowed coat who believed every word. I need someone, I said finally, who can turn a number into a court order. The next morning, I knocked on the door of Eleanor Pruitt's office. Eleanor Pruitt had been practicing trust and estate litigation for 30 years and had the kind of office where nothing on the walls was trying to impress you. She read my file for 40 minutes without speaking. I'd organized it the way I organize everything: chronological, indexed, every claim tied to a document. When she finished, she took off her glasses and looked at me for a while. "In my career," she said, "most people bring me suspicion, a feeling that they've been wronged, and a hope that I can find the proof. You brought me the proof and asked me to find the procedure." She tapped the forensic report. Forged beneficiary consents, an undisclosed trust, self-dealing by a trustee, conversion of the entire corpus into a private enterprise. "This isn't a family argument, Ms. Bolton. This is a fiduciary breach with a fraud sitting on top of it, and the fraud has your brother's signature on it as the witness." "I know. Do you want to protect him?" I thought about the question honestly. "No," I said. "I want the truth on the record, whoever it lands on." "Good. That's the only client I can win for." She put her glasses back on. "Here's how this works. We move on several fronts at once, because that's how you keep a trustee from emptying the accounts the second she's served. We petitioned to remove her as trustee. We filed to compel a full accounting she cannot survive on paper, and because we can already show she's actively spending converted assets, the jeweler for one, we asked the court for an order freezing the assets before she can move them. How fast? I'll be honest with you, because I don't believe in selling people fantasies. The final reckoning, the full judgment, every dollar traced and returned, takes time. Cases like this can run a year or more, but the temporary relief, the part that takes the ground out from under her, the freeze, the removal, the orders that stop her cold while the rest plays out, that I can have moving within months, and she has no idea it's coming, which is the only real advantage you'll ever have over a woman like this. She'll say I'm making it up, I said. She's very good at that. It's the thing she does best. Eleanor almost smiled. She can say whatever she likes. A signature she forged doesn't care what she says. A bank record doesn't care. That's why people like your mother hate people like us. She slid a retainer agreement across the desk. "Bring me the pen and the paper. I'll bring the law." I signed it with my father's fountain pen. The cap was worn smooth under my thumb. It felt correct, the way a number feels correct when it finally reconciles. Eleanor asked whether anyone inside the firm that had administered the trust might testify. She made some calls. A week later, I got a call back from a woman named Pamela Voss, a compliance officer there. Pamela was careful on the phone, the way people are when they've thought about something for a long time and never once had anyone to say it to. "I can only speak to what's documented, and I can only produce records under proper legal process," she said first, getting the boundary out of the way. "I won't say anything off the books that puts the file at risk." "I understand." But a pause, and when she went on, her voice had changed. Person to person. "I flagged this trust 2 years ago. The disbursement pattern never sat right with me. The irregular amounts, the same destination account, the consents that all came in together. I escalated it internally. I wrote a memo. Nothing happened. Things like this, sometimes, nothing happens. A breath. When your accounting request came in, I made sure it routed through my open review instead of the trustee notice queue. That's why your mother was never told you'd asked. As far as she knows, no one has looked at this in 12 years. When your lawyer's order comes through, everything will be exactly where it should be." I thanked her, and I meant it more than the words could carry. There it was, an institution with a paper trail. A compliance officer with a conscience and a 2-year-old memo who'd quietly kept my mother blind. A forensic report tying it all to a single, forged signature, witnessed by my brother. Every piece was in place. Every piece except one. Timing. Because here is what my mother still didn't understand. Sitting in her house planning her speech for my wedding, If she thought of me at all, she thought her difficult daughter was off somewhere licking old wounds. She didn't know Eleanor had already filed the petition. She didn't know we'd already requested the freeze. She didn't know the legal machinery she'd dodged for 12 years was already turning quietly in a building downtown, waiting only for the right moment to land. She loves an audience, I thought. I'll give her one. There was a moment 2 weeks before the wedding when I nearly didn't wait. She called me about the seating chart, and somewhere in the middle of a sentence about table linens, she said, lightly, "I just hope you're not going to make this day about your little grievances, Molly." People do remember who keeps the peace. I had the forensic report on the desk in front of me. For about 4 seconds, I wanted, more than I have ever wanted anything, to read her the dates right then. I didn't, because a private confrontation is a thing she could rewrite by morning. The private room was her whole game. A public record in front of the same people she'd spent 12 years telling her version to, with documents already filed downtown that she could not rewrite. So I said, I just want the day to go the way it should, and I let her hear what she wanted to hear, and I hung up and went back to the file. Patience is just anger that has learned to read a calendar. When she called to accept the invitation, because of course she accepted, she would never miss a stage. She offered in the same breath to help with the costs, to give me a wedding gift you'll never forget. "No, thank you," I said. "I have everything I need." There was a silence on the line that lasted a beat too long. She wasn't used to no. "Well," she said finally, "I'll say a few words at the reception. Family's family. Just don't embarrass me, Molly." I almost laughed. Grant handled the part I couldn't bring myself to handle. He spent the week before the wedding with the venue's AV technician, building the photo slideshow that would play behind the head table, and, quietly, a second deck on the same laptop, with the tech briefed to switch the screen to it on Grant's nod. Whatever my mother thought she'd be putting up there, the screen belonged to us. We rehearsed only the mechanics: which file, which order, how long to hold on each. "You count," Grant said when we'd run it for the last time. "I'll click. That's the deal." The night before the wedding, alone, I read my father's letter again. "Count. Don't argue. You were always the one who counted." Then my phone lit up. A text from my mother. "I'll be giving a toast. Make sure they bring me the microphone. And Molly, don't make it about you." She was preparing a speech. I was preparing a reckoning. The ballroom was beautiful. I'll give her that much. She had insisted on inserting herself into the planning, and she had taste. 155 guests at round tables under warm light, a giant screen behind the head table. Everyone we'd ever known, and everyone she'd ever needed to perform for, gathered in one room under one roof. My brother Bryce stood near her in a gray suit, holding a champagne flute he wasn't drinking. He kept glancing at the screen, then at the laptop on the AV table by the wall, then at the screen again. He looked like a man waiting for a verdict, and I filed that away, because Bryce had never in his life looked nervous at a party. My mother worked the room like a senator the night before an election. When she reached a cluster of my father's old friends, she lowered her voice into the register she saved for sincerity, the one I'd heard through a kitchen doorway at 16. "My daughter and I have had our struggles," she told them. "I won't pretend otherwise. But family's everything. That's what today is really about." People nodded. People always nodded. I watched a man who had known my father for 40 years nod at the woman who told that man, at the funeral, that Walter left her nothing but debt. Halfway through the salad course, Bryce found a reason to pass behind my chair. He leaned down, close to my ear, his voice low and tight. "Whatever you think you know," he said, "don't. Not here, not tonight. For me." I turned my head just enough to look at him. His forehead was damp. "For you," I repeated. "Molly, please." I didn't answer. I watched him straighten up and walk back to his seat, and I thought, he knows what's on those consents. He has always known. The only thing he doesn't know is that I know too. The witness had just confirmed his own guilt at my wedding without being asked a single question. The first toast came, Grant's brother, warm and clumsy, my college roommate who cried a little. And then my mother rose, smoothing her dress over her hips, and crossed to the microphone with the smile of a woman who has waited a very long time for the floor and intends to use all of it. She tapped the glass with a manicured nail. The room quieted. "Before you celebrate her," she said, and the warmth was already draining out of her voice, like water out of a cracked glass. "I think you deserve to know who she really is." I didn't move. Under the table, Grant slid his hand toward the laptop and rested it there. She nodded to the booth at the back. The first slide came up, a flattering portrait of herself, captioned with her own name, and beneath it, the single word, Founder. A laugh rippled through the room, uncertain. Then she clicked again. The screen filled with a bank statement. It was a forgery, and a crude one, if you knew what to look for. The font on the header didn't match the bank's real font. The running balance didn't actually reconcile down the column. But no one in that room knew what to look for, except me. She'd never needed it to survive an accountant. She only needed it to survive a ballroom. My name was across the top, Molly Bolton. Below it, a list of withdrawals printed in red, and stamped diagonally across it in heavy black letters, Unauthorized Withdrawals. She had built a fake bank statement to prove I'd stolen from the family. The irony was so total, so perfectly inverted, that for one strange second I nearly admired it. She had committed the exact crime she was now projecting onto a screen with my name on it, 20 feet tall. She seized the microphone fully now, both hands, and the venom came up through the smile until the smile was just a place to put it. "Don't clap for her," she snarled, sweeping a hand at the screen. "You're applauding a disgusting fraud who's been robbing her own family blind." The ballroom detonated, gasps first, then the low, ugly sound of a room turning all at once. I felt 155 sets of eyes land on me and curdle. An uncle I'd known since childhood shook his head slowly. A woman near the front pressed her hand over her mouth. One of my own bridesmaids stared at her plate and would not look at me. I sat very still in my white dress and let it wash over me, the full weight of 12 years arriving at once in a single room. And then a strange thing happened inside me. It didn't crush me. It steadied me, because I'd felt this exact thing 1,000 times in that kitchen, alone, with no documents, and no lawyer, and no proof. This time, I had all three. My mother stood at the microphone, triumphant, watching me the way she'd watched me my whole life, waiting for me to break, to cry, to make myself the victim so she could turn to the room and say, "See, this is what she always does." I turned to Grant. I smiled. "Begin." He stood up. My mother's smile widened because she thought I was leaving. She thought I had finally broken and was walking out, handing her the ending she'd written in advance. He walked to the laptop. At the back of the room, the technician switched the feed, and the screen stopped being hers. And he pressed play. The first thing the room heard was my mother's voice. Not the woman at the microphone. A younger version, recorded, scratchy through the ballroom speakers, but unmistakable. It was a voicemail. She had left it for Russell Ainsworth in 2014, freely of her own choosing. And Russell, who keeps everything, had kept it. "Russell, it's Diane. The insurance cleared. I moved it into the firm. She's 19, she'd waste it. As far as anyone knows, there was no trust. Let's keep it that way." The ballroom went silent the way a struck bell goes silent, not quiet but still ringing. I watched it land on the faces around me. They had just heard my mother, in her own voice, on a date stamped years before tonight, admit there was a trust. Admit she had moved it into her company. Admit she intended to make sure no one ever knew it existed. My mother had gone white. That's been edited, she said, but she said it into the live microphone, and the live microphone caught it and made it small and thin against the size of the voice that had just filled the room. That was the first slide, I said. My voice carried because I had practiced carrying it across exactly this much room. Grant clicked. The forged statement was gone. In its place, clean and dated and real, was the insurance policy. $1.8 million. Sole beneficiary spelled out in full. Molly Ann Bolton. Click. The disbursement records. The money walking, increment by careful increment, out of my trust and into the seed account of Crestline Capital Group. A column of dates and amounts that a room of laypeople couldn't read in detail, but could absolutely read in shape. Money leaving one place and arriving at another. Click. A consent form. Molly Ann Bolton, in a signature that was not mine, dated a day I was 400 miles away, at freshman move-in. Beside it, the dorm check-in record. Beside that, the forensic examiner's conclusion, blown up large enough for the back tables. Signature inconsistent with verified exemplars. Deliberate imitation by a second party. Click. The jeweler's invoice. $62,000. 8 months after the funeral. Paid from the Crestline account. And beside it, a photograph of my mother at a Christmas party. The diamond bracelet bright on her wrist, caught mid-gesture, mid-sentence. I knew exactly what she had been saying when that photo was taken. So, now, did everyone. Eleanor Pruitt rose from her seat at a back table, where she had been sitting quietly all evening in a navy suit no one had thought to question. Every figure on that screen, she said in the flat, unhurried voice of a woman who has won before and fully expects to win again, is already filed with the court. Somewhere to my left, the man who had known my father for 40 years got slowly to his feet. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at my mother, and his face had gone gray. "You stood at his funeral," he said. Not loud, but the room had gone so quiet that it carried to every corner. "You stood there and you told me he left you with nothing. I wrote you a check that week, to help. Do you remember that?" My mother did not answer him. She couldn't. There was no version of the night that survived that question, and for the first time in her life, she seemed to understand that the room was no longer hers to shape. My mother reached for the table. Her hand found the white cloth and gripped a fistful of it, and her heels seemed to betray her all at once, and she swayed and clutched and did not quite fall, but came close, this woman who had never once lost her footing in public. The floor had not vanished, only the story had, and it turned out the story had been the only thing holding her up. And then, Bryce broke. I had not planned for Bryce. I had braced for him to deny, to stonewall, to plant himself beside her the way he had for 33 years. Instead, he made a sound, half a word, strangled, and stepped forward into the light, sweating now. "She made me witness it," he said, and the whole room swung toward him. I was 21. She put the papers in front of me and told me to sign as the witness, that's all. Just sign as the witness, and I... His voice climbed, cracked, aimed itself at her. I told you forging Molly's name would catch up to us. I said it every year, and you told me to stop being dramatic." Mom, tell them I didn't know what it was. Tell them. He stopped, because he had just told them himself. He had just told 155 people that he knew the signature was forged, that he knew whose name it was, that he had known for 12 years. Exactly the thing that I had supposedly imagined. In trying to save himself, he had become the second witness against her, and this time, the signature was his own voice. My mother turned to her son. And for the first time in my entire life, I watched her open her mouth and find nothing inside it. No story, no redirection. No, that's just Bryce. He gets worked up. The two of them stood inside the spotlight they had built for my humiliation, looking at each other, and the alliance that had defined my whole childhood came apart in real time, in front of every person who had ever believed in it. Grant clicked one last time. It was my father's letter, scanned, his own handwriting, the sevens with their little bars. The last line filled the screen, 20 feet of it, in the hand of a man 12 years dead. This is hers. Make sure they know it. I stood up. I didn't rush. I crossed the floor to the microphone, and my mother stepped back from it without being asked, which I think surprised her as much as it surprised the room. I took it out of her hand. It was the first time in 31 years that I had taken anything from my mother that she had not chosen to give me. I looked out at the 155 faces that, 10 minutes ago, had looked at me like something to scrape off a shoe. I'm not asking the room to believe me anymore, I said. I'm telling you what happens next. I kept it short because the documents had already said everything. The trust would be restored. The court already had the filings. It had had them for weeks. My mother was, as of a motion filed long before this reception, in the process of being removed as trustee, and the accounts of Crestling Capital Group were, as Eleanor had put it to me on the phone, a matter the court would be addressing very, very soon. I did not raise my voice once. I had learned, a long time ago, that the more it costs me, the quieter I get. It had cost me 12 years to walk to that microphone. I was the quietest I have ever been in my life. I set the microphone down on the table. In the silence afterward, a woman I didn't know, one of my mother's friends seated at a front table, someone who had booed with the rest of them 10 minutes earlier, stood up. She didn't say anything. She just walked, in front of everyone, around the head table and across the open floor, and she stopped in front of me and put her hand on my shoulder. Her eyes were wet. She didn't have to speak. Then the applause came back. It was quieter than the boos had been, and slower to build, gathering one pair of hands at a time. And it was not for her. The court's order was served the following morning, while my mother was still, I imagine, deciding which version of the night to tell. Eleanor called me at the hotel. Grant answered and handed me the phone without a word. "The order's served," she said. "The court froze the Crestline accounts this morning, pending the full accounting. The trustee removal is on the calendar for next month, and on this record, it isn't going to be close." A pause that, from Eleanor, counted as warmth. "You understand, you built this case yourself. The forensics, the timeline, the impossibility on the consent dates. I just carried it into the building and said the magic words." She paused again, and then she said the thing I hadn't let myself ask. "And Molly, a file like this doesn't stay civil." Forgery and conversion are crimes before they're lawsuits. A copy is already on a desk at the district attorney's office. What they do with it isn't ours to decide, but they'll be deciding. I thanked her. Then I sat on the edge of the hotel bed in my going-away clothes and watched my phone fill with messages. Bryce called 11 times. I didn't answer. There was nothing I could say to Bryce that a court date wouldn't say better and more permanently, and I had finally learned the thing it took me 31 years to learn, that I am allowed to let a phone ring. He had had 12 years to call me with the truth. He didn't get to spend tonight unburdening himself onto me. The relatives came after that, in a particular order that told me everything. First, the ones who had done the arithmetic and wanted, urgently, to be standing on the right side of it before it hardened. Their messages were long and full of words, like always sensed and never quite trusted. Those I read once and deleted. Then, more slowly, came the ones who had actually felt something. An aunt, the same aunt who used to smile when my mother said, "That's just Molly. She rewrites everything," sent 2 messages. The first was long and explained and reached for reasons. The second came an hour later and was 4 sentences. We should have listened. All of us. I'm sorry, Molly. We should have listened years ago. I didn't write back right away. I am not built for instant forgiveness, and I wasn't going to perform it for anyone's comfort, including my own. But I kept that second message because it was the first time in my life that someone in my family had said the thing plainly out loud. Not that I was difficult, but that I had been right, and they had chosen year after year not to hear it. The word that had followed me for 12 years, unstable, dramatic, she rewrites everything, stopped circulating almost overnight. The same network that had carried my mother's version faithfully for over a decade turned out to carry the truth just as efficiently, the moment it arrived with documents attached. I let them. I didn't need them to have always known. I only needed them to know now, and to stop repeating the lie at the next table. In March, the court ruled on the temporary orders. My mother was formally removed as trustee. The frozen assets stayed frozen, pending the full accounting Eleanor had compelled, the one my mother could not survive on paper, because paper does not care how charming you are. The empire she had built from ashes turned out, in the cold, flat language of a court order, to have been built from the conversion of trust assets belonging to a single named beneficiary. I didn't go to the hearing. I had already seen her face in a ballroom. I didn't need to see it in a courtroom. And I had something better to do that day. The money came back to me slowly, the way money does when courts are involved, in increments, with paperwork, with verification at every step. It suited me fine. I am, after all, a person who likes increments and paperwork. They're honest in a way people often aren't. I didn't keep most of it. I had thought about this for a long time, longer than the case itself. What do you do with $1.8 million that was always meant to be a beginning and got turned into a weapon instead? My father had handed me a pen and told me there was a number, and he had trusted me to read it. He never told me what to do with it once I had. That part, I think, he left to me on purpose. He knew his daughter, he knew I'd count first, and decide after. I set up a fund. Small to start, run carefully, the way I run everything. It pays tuition and first and last month deposits and emergency rent for young people who have been cut off by families who decided to teach them a lesson. There is no application essay about gratitude. There is no requirement to be grateful at all, ever, to anyone. I learned everything I will ever need to know about being told to be grateful for the scraps of my own inheritance. When the paperwork to establish the fund was ready, Eleanor brought it to me herself to sign. I used my father's fountain pen. The same black pen with the worn cap. The one I'd kept in a drawer for 12 years without understanding it. The one I'd held the night the whole story cracked open under a kitchen light. The one I'd signed Eleanor's retainer with. It had spent 12 years being the last confusing thing a dying man gave me. Now it was the thing that signed money into a life instead of out of one. The money was always meant to set someone free, I told Grant that night. I just changed who. I keep the pen on my desk now, capped where I can see it while I work. My mother taught a room of 155 people to call me a liar, and she was very good at it. She'd had 12 years of practice and a lifetime of charm before that. But charm isn't a number, and a story isn't a signature, and in the end, the thing that saved me wasn't a louder voice or a better speech. It was the slow, unglamorous, unkillable fact that money moves, and movement leaves a record, and a record can be read by anyone patient enough to sit down and look. My mother taught a room to call me a liar. The numbers taught the room to call me by my name. If you stayed with me all the way to the end of this one, you already know it was never really about the money. Tell me in the comments who in your life needed to hear, "This is hers." And if Molly's Quiet won you over, subscribe and stay. because the next story is the kind you'll want to send to someone before it's even finished. I was ready to read the number, Dad. I read it. The number was enough.